Welcome to a series dedicated to the theories of personality. These videos will take up an introductory analysis of those approaches to personality that have had a significant impact on the field of psychology. Today's video draws from Carl Jung's essay entitled The Structure of the Unconscious. I thought I'd do something a little different today and try to diagram the theory of personality that is presented by Carl Jung in this essay. So let us start from the beginning and work our way to the distinctive ideas promoted by Carl Jung, especially the collective unconscious. So we can begin with a circle that will help us to distinguish external reality from internal reality. From there, we can make another division between conscious and unconscious. This division includes a line that will go in the upper half of the circle, indicating that the larger part of the mind is the unconscious, whereas consciousness only makes up a small portion of this. Now, within the unconscious, in discussing Freud, we spoke of what Carl Jung will call the personal unconscious. This contains contents related to the unique life of the individual, including things that are repressed but capable of being made conscious again, such as through psychoanalysis. This will include the individual traumas and other kinds of unwelcomed events that have happened in our lives. Though he doesn't mention it in this essay, Carl Jung will eventually associate this personal unconscious with the shadow, which involves those characteristics of ourselves that we are most repulsed by and so push out of awareness. As a result of this, the personal unconscious can contain not just what are typically considered negative qualities, but also positive qualities. If you consciously identify yourself negatively, then it might be the case that the shadow is actually a more positive version of yourself. Now, the personal unconscious itself grows out of the collective psyche and is intimately bound to it. And Carl Jung's unique contribution is in adding this collective dimension. The collective or impersonal unconscious has no direct connection with the individual's life. It is a deeper layer that produces an enlargement of who we are and contains certain fundamental, general, and impersonal characteristics of humanity. The evidence that Carl Jung points to demonstrate this include the fact that a wide range of mental functions are shared across cultures, displaying a remarkable correspondence that's evident in the thematic consistencies across various myths. As such, the collective unconscious consists of various forms or primordial images, or what he'll later call archetypes, drawing from the collective myths to infer these universal forms, categories through which we experience reality. Now, one thing about the archetypes that's of interest is that they contain various types or attitudes and characteristics that are bound together in pairs or opposites, such as, most famously, extroversion and introversion. In the development of the psyche, eventually the individual emerges in such a way as to differentiate itself from the rest of the collective psyche. And it does this by appropriating some of the types or characteristics that are located in those forms within the unconscious. At the same time, the other half of the pairs that are not identified with remain in the unconscious. The relationship between the individual and the collective unconscious is filled with tension, potentially. Jung analogizes the individual's relationship with the group as being similar to how the individual psyche is connected to the collective psyche, and he extends this metaphor to show how individuals can act in ways that are more in their own self-interest rather than the group, or how they can forego their particular interests for the sake of fully immersing themselves in the group. Out of the conflict that emerges between individual and collective, the collective unconscious becomes repressed Now, this repression isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's a necessary component of the development of personality, but it can also give rise to problems when the individual and collective are not in communication with one another. The persona is something that we might mistake for the individual. However, it's actually that part of the mind in which a part of the psyche adjusts itself by putting on a mask and playing a particular role, one that is not always consistent with who the individual is. So the persona is the collection of psychic or characterological elements that are conscious but are yet built up from the collective psyche. At the same time, another kind of persona emerges, but this time in the unconscious, whereas the persona identifies with a select set of traits that it assumes in reaction to external reality. The anima or animus takes up the opposite traits and assumes them for itself. And so the anima or animus is the opposite of one's personality. The anima can often be personified as those individuals in external reality who we find very attractive and desirable. So with all these divisions that have formed, there is a motivational force in the psyche, what's called a unifying function, that projects out symbols that are representations of the unacknowledged parts of the collective unconscious. And these symbols get expressed in a variety of ways. Internally, when symbols are expressed, they manifest as dreams and the imagination and fantasy. When expressed in external reality, they may manifest as religion, myths, literature, magic, and today, movies. It's this mechanism that Carl Jung believes helps to account for the commonalities he observed across different cultures over time, cultures that had no contact with one another when these myths formed. Now, these symbols act as signposts, providing clues to carry on our lives in harmony with ourselves. The symbol is not a sign that designates something we know. Its meaning resides in the fact that it's an attempt to elucidate, to clarify something still entirely unknown or that's in the process of formation. Another form of projection happens through the anima or animus. In that situation, we locate in external reality, as I mentioned already, those who we become extremely attracted to, who we find desirable, who are like a soulmate. In response to the persona's confrontation with the collective unconscious, there's a couple of reactions that might happen. The persona may try to fully reject the collective unconscious and reassert itself. And this is a kind of individualism that we see on display often in Western societies. Another response is to become fully immersed and absorbed in the collective unconscious, identifying with the collective and downplaying and devaluing the individual. Carl Jung calls this the monistic tendency, the tendency to try to reduce things to one. But the goal is not to identify with the persona or to become completely absorbed in the collective unconscious, but rather it's about enlarging the individual, who is not the same as the persona. The individual includes components that are conscious and unconscious. Through the unifying function, the individual does have the opportunity to integrate these symbols, to let those symbols speak to it in such a way as to be able to integrate more into itself without losing itself. So the individual is the one who has differentiated itself, distinguished itself from the collective unconscious, and yet at the same time is also drawing it in and connecting with it. Individuation is the process by which that happens, by which the individual becomes more and more integrated without falling for the monistic tendency. Psychoanalysis then, according to Carl Jung, or what he will call analytic therapy later on, is about about individuation, and the analyst is meant to be the one who helps the client come into contact with and conversation with the different symbols that emerge from dreams, imagination, fantasy, and also symbols in the external world. All this is in pursuit of gaining an adequate knowledge of oneself and to further the process of individuation, which is for most people a lifelong journey. In thinking about Carl Jung in light of the 3 pillars, we can consider nature to be the sort of genetic inheritance of these archetypes, which are universal and based in the way the brain is formed. Culture is a little interesting here because in some ways culture overlaps with nature in that what emerge from nature are the archetypes, but is also the basis for culture, providing the myths and symbols that inform that particular society. So in a sense, culture represents both the universal inheritance of the collective psyche, as well as the unique ways in which that collective psyche is expressed in society. And then there are events. Carl Jung doesn't talk about it in these terms, but events very well might be those encounters with symbols that awaken within us the movement of individuation. So when there's the event of meeting someone who evokes very strong feelings, it awakens something in me that I now have the opportunity to dialogue with and possibly integrate. And this is true for when I meet people or experience things that create feelings of anger or hate, as well as feelings of love. We might think of certain religious experiences, which Carl Jung talked a lot about, leading to these sort of awakening moments that allows the individual to suddenly grasp what has been outside of it this entire time and to bring into its sphere those collective elements that have thus far been left out. So that concludes our brief summary of Carl Jung. Next time we're going to move to a figure who is not typically read for a theories of personality class, but I think offers an important voice to a dimension of personality theory that is often neglected. And so we're going to read a chapter from Frantz Fanon's book, Black Skin, White Masks. If you wish to support this work, feel free to like and share this video and subscribe to my channel. And until next time, be well.